right now on Amplified.
You're absolutely right about climate change and sea level rise and all that. And we have to design around that. And I suppose one of the key things is adaptation. And essentially that's changing what you have to deal with what you know is going to happen.
Hi there, my name is Dusty Rhodes and you're welcome to Amplified, the Engineers Journal podcast. Our guest today is the engineering lead behind Ireland's fishery harbours and coastal infrastructure. He's modernised public sector projects with GIS mapping, drones and strict spending compliance while mentoring engineers through professional qualifications. We'll be hearing about his journey from Cork construction sites to chief engineer, the realities of upgrading harbours against climate challenges, and advice on thriving in public sector engineering. It's a pleasure to welcome Chief Engineer at the Marine Engineering Division of the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, Noel Clancy. How you doing, Noel?
Very well, Dusty, and delighted to be here.
So listen, just to kind of warm us up or to get us started, how did you get into this game of engineering at all? What attracted you?
That's a very good question, Dusty, and to reflect way back. I suppose my first indication of anything in terms of liking engineering would have been late in national school when we were drawing plans of rooms. For what reason, no, I can't entirely remember, but that was my first inkling of any sense of a direction. Then in second level, I certainly recall I spent my first year doing art and realised at the end of that year, art was not for me. I wasn't very good at it. So I changed to mechanical drawing and I preferred the straight lines and the angles and that. So that then combined with, I liked maths and I liked the sciences. I wasn't very fond of history and geography. So that was the subject choice at the time. So I came to my leaving cert with maths and mechanical drawing and knew at that point in time that's what I wanted to do. So progressed then to UCC, to civil engineering in UCC and graduated in 1983.
Now listen, there's a huge difference between, kind of being at school and university and then getting out into the world. Do you remember your first project where you were like proper hands-on?
I do, yeah. 1983, for any of us that remember that, was a difficult time. I suppose we came out into the middle of a deep recession. Certainly in terms of civil engineering and building works, the activity level was very low. So I started with a mechanical engineering contractor in, of all places, an animal byproducts factory in South Tipperary. So that wasn't very pleasant, but it was my first hands-on projects experience. But It was useful. It was useful. And I moved quickly to that, to work as an RE in a wastewater treatment plant. It was still low levels of construction activity. So I'd say in the late 80s, I immigrated to the UK and joined a civil engineering contractor in Southampton.
I remember the 80s as well. And you know how in Ireland we talk about the grey cloud is just down over us all the time. The mood of the country was like that. It was like that in people's hearts at the time, and a lot of people were moving to the UK and you did some time in the UK as well. But eventually you came back, 90s, a little bit better, and you had a really, really big job at Dunboy Castle. Please tell me about this.
That was an unusual project. I'd moved that. I had done a number of other projects in advancement of that. However, Dunboy Castle was an old castle on the western side of Castletownbere, quite close to the former site of where the O'Sullivan Bear clan came from. It had been in dereliction for many, many years. And there was a group of investors that were very interested in developing it into, essentially, Dusty, we were talking about a 6-7 star hotel. So it was very, very high level, Again, there was the old castle itself. There was a new block built to the rear of the castle. There was substantial investment. There was probably anything up to 35, 40 million spent on the project. But unfortunately, it never completed. And it remains in a state of, I would say, 90% complete, but not complete and operating. Problem there was the investors that were involved had difficulties in raising adequate funding to complete the project. And I am aware of it now because, funnily enough, one of the harbours that I look after for the department is Castletownbere. So I'm regularly in Castletownbere. I regularly see the castle out to the west. And I would be in contact with people that were involved in that project. So unfortunately, never finished. And I believe it's still on the market, but that's something I'm not involved in.
Madness. Yeah. I've heard of properties like that, and they will sit empty for 30 or 40 or 50 years even when somebody will come along.
Yeah.
But tell me, Dunboy Castle you said it was a ruin, essentially.
Yeah.
So I have a picture of a ruined castle in my mind. Yeah. Is it like that?
It is, yeah. It is, yeah.
So what was going through your mind? I mean, what were you told? This is what we need to do. And then what were the problems you had to kind of how do you turn a bunch of centuries old rocks and think about a luxury hotel?
It's very specialist. You're absolutely right. It was a ruined castle, and it was Puxley's manor, actually, as in Puxley's were the family that lived there. And actually, I believe they never lived there for very long, but it was one of those houses that were probably burnt down at the early part of the century. So it was in a stateroom from probably the early 1920s. So we had quite a group of specialist contractors to essentially restore that. So it was quite difficult even if you think of the stone in the first place. There was a lot of cut stone in it, and we were trying to replicate the stone that was previously used. And a methodology of reconstructed stone was used. Essentially, you were trying to do trial mixes of concrete with aggregates through it that essentially replicated the stone that was there previously, but it wasn't the same. So there was a lot of trial mixing and getting the stone part of it correct. The roof was quite specialist. The slates, again, I remember they were blue Bangor slates, again, specially imported from the UK to match what was previously there. The windows were steel casement windows. So again, trying to replicate the original windows that were in the manor. So that was the external envelope of the building. And then once you got inside, a lot of the key tricks to the old building and ensuring that it could work as a new building was understanding that it had been exposed to the elements for many years. The walls had probably soaked copious amounts of water. So you weren't going to be able to seal that up internally and expect no problem. So you had to allow for that in the inner parts of the building. So essentially the building had to breathe and had to be allowed to breathe, and any dampness that was in the wall bricks had to be allowed to release itself. So that was all part of the internal fabric of the building. And then there was the floors and etc. But I suppose a lot of conservation expertise, both from conservation architects and conservation contractors, worked with us to try and deliver that. Now, that was the old part. There was a new part at the back, but that would have been standard new construction. That wouldn't have been as interesting.
By comparison, it's no problem.
No, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Have you been up on any of your drives past just to kind of see what kind of state it is in? Is it still in kind of a dilapidated or an abandoned state, or is it watertight? Or?
Yeah, it's still holding its own. It's in probably a sad sight in a way, because it's a building that was dilapidated. It was very close to completion, and you'd say, wouldn't it be wonderful if this could be used for something? It may be, again, sometimes timing, pitching at very high-end hotel operators, 6-7 stars, very, very high. Maybe if a more modest ambition was there, that may be operating. And look, I've heard a number of times in recent years that has been nearly sold, but it's still vacant. But no, it still looks well, and it still looks okay. It's just a pity that there's a temporary fence still around, that it's been...
There you go.
Yeah.
You spent 30 years in the private sector, and I know I'm skipping through it very, very fast.
No, it's fine.
Another one that people might know, you were a contract director with Bowen on a big 80 million development they did at Opera Lane. Please tell me about that.
Yeah, that was a difficult one, because I suppose I had come off an earlier project when similarly, but this was in Patrick Street in Cork, which is the main thoroughfare in Cork City, shopping street, high levels of pedestrian traffic, etc. And essentially there were 2 blocks in the centre that were to be redeveloped. So all the phases of it, this was where the Irish Examiner newspaper, their offices were previously housed there. So all the previous buildings that were in the 2 blocks needed to be demolished, levelled. And then the most challenging part of it was that we were to essentially construct a 2-storey basement. So for anyone that knows Patrick Street in Cork, it's challenging in terms of the environment you're working in, but also there's a very high water table in the centre of Cork. So certainly when you have high tides, and the middle island of Cork is between the 2 channels of the Lee. So you could dig down 1.5, 2 meters in the middle of Cork and you'll be in water. So we were talking about a 2-story basement here that was going to dig down maybe 12, 13 meters in the middle of Cork. So how do we do that, right? So I suppose the first thing you have to do is to build your retaining wall around the perimeter. And there are a number of methodologies that can be used to do that. What we chose in Patrick Street was a secant pile wall. Now, for anyone that doesn't know what a secant pile wall is essentially, it's a hit and miss rotary pile. So you have these large rigs that drill a rotary core into the ground. You fill that core with concrete and a reinforcement. Then you'll move on with a little gap, do a second one. Then you come back and you fill between the two you've done. So essentially cutting into the two. So you've like 2 piles adjacent and a third one in between that cuts into the two. So it forms a wall and a seal. So essentially that was the methodology. There was a German company, Bauer, did the works for us. They had some fairly massive piling gear on site. They manufacture and install their own piles. So they build the piling rigs, but they also supply the crew that operate the rigs and do the piling. So there was 4 of those operating together at the one time. That was the wall. So we say you build the wall around the perimeter in the first place. Then you want to dig out the centre. So we start digging. Now, obviously, there are archaeologists involved, and we did have some finds of bits of old boats and archaeological pieces of interest. But as you go down, the water that I talked about earlier is there. So how do we deal with the water? And what we did for dewatering there was a system called well pointing. So essentially outside the perimeter of the retaining wall that we had constructed, we installed well points, which were drilled like a well, as if you were drilling a well out in the countryside for water. You install a number of these well points with submersible pumps within them. Then you connect those to each other and essentially you start pumping the water table down outside the hole that you want to dig. Once you have that control, now that's the simple explanation of it. There's a lot of technology behind how that's pumped, how the water is controlled, how it's discharged, all that sort of thing. Once you have the water controlled, then you're essentially digging in the dry within the hole. And that was it.
Yeah. And everything that you've described there, I mean, it sounds like a mammoth job, but you have to remember you're doing it on the main street of the second biggest city in the country.
Correct.
So, that's a challenge. What was the one thing you learned from that? Did you kind of walked away from it and kind of went, that like a new skill or just something that clicked in your head? Or
I suppose one of the things I learned from that is we were working for a well-known developer in Cork at the time.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot from him, and in particular as a contractor, and that's what I was at the time, we were contracted to them to carry out the work. But the relationships that we had to have with neighbours, with local authorities, with regulatory bodies, etc. Now, they were very expert at that. I wasn't, but I learned a lot from them. And look, clearly when you're working as closely as what you are to essentially businesses that are trying to operate around you, it's very important to have a relationship, and it's very important to have no surprises. So to have everything properly planned, know what you're doing, and have everybody informed as to what's doing.
Did you find that simple communication with those people solved a lot of problems in advance?
Absolutely. And again, like I suppose before we started, we had meetings with the stakeholders and the neighbours, etc., to let them know. We had representatives from the neighbours. That made it easier for us in that there were 1 or 2 points of contact instead of multiple points of contact. We had regular newsletters. We had a number of means of communicating to them. And yeah, that certainly helps, yeah.
Noel, let's go from your experience in the private sector. You moved into the public sector. That's a jump mentally, I would imagine. Tell me, what were the challenges that, working for a government department, what were they doing that was of interest to you that you went, I think I'll have a crack at this?
I suppose a lot of it actually was circumstance more than anything else. Again, I suppose I'd spoken earlier about our 80s experience. In the 2011-12s, We had a second experience in Ireland. So essentially, which was the crash, where a lot of contractors got into difficulty with the dramatic drop in activity again, So it was more by circumstance than by choice it came about. I actually moved to Dublin for a while and worked with a consultant there. What came about is the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine Engineering Division have a base in Clonakilty. That's where I'm from. That's where I live. So I was working in Dublin and this opportunity presented itself. So that, more than anything else, drove me.
All right. Okay.
As well as that, I suppose it was the marine. I had an interest in the marine. I had a boat. I liked fishing, and all that. So I had an interest in the area.
We'll return to this episode of Amplified in a moment, but first a reminder of the many amazing people that we have spoken to over the years, including Louise O'Flanagan, Head of Engineering at EirGrid, who shared a powerful lesson on why the best engineering plans aren't always found on a drawing board.
As an engineer, you can have the most perfect plan on paper, but unless you actually meaningfully engage with your stakeholders and communities, that's maybe where that plan will stay, possibly, is on paper. And actually, it's one that I took away and I've learned a lot from that experience.
You can get that episode with Louise O'Flanagan from EirGrid on your podcast player right now, along, of course, with many, many other great interviews from our back catalogue. Right now, let's return to our interview on this episode of Amplified. Just to give us a quick overview of the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, it's much bigger than a lot of people would think. I mean, there's 4,000 staff nationwide just in it. But in the Marine Department where you are, it's a relatively small subsection. There's about 100 people. How many of them are engineers?
Yeah, I suppose you're absolutely right. Look, it's a huge department. The annual budget for the Department of Marine is in excess of 2 billion. So it's a huge organisation with over 4,000 staff. The Marine, and sometimes I'm not entirely sure whether that's the correct name. It's very related to fisheries, what we do,
Okay.
But anyway, the Marine is what it's called. The Marine side or element of the department is based in Clonakilty. Now, the department overall is divided into divisions for various areas of responsibility. There are probably 70 odd divisions scattered around the country, mostly based in Dublin, probably Portlaoise and Wexford. But the Marine section is based in Clonakilty and there's 6 divisions in that area. Of the Marine divisions, we are one. So first of all, the Marine area, there's probably somewhere in the region of 120 to 150 staff based in the office in Clonakilty. That's what's there, right? In the context of the Marine Engineering Division, we'd have a total staff just in excess of 100. In terms of engineers, we carry some vacancies from time to time, probably no more than anybody else. We have about 30 engineers in our staff. But in addition to that, we would have, first of all, I suppose we have the operational and management of the harbours under our remit. And I should probably explain what they are. There are 6 dedicated fishery harbour centres in the country. They came about under 1968 Act at the time, where the intent of government at that time was to develop essentially centres of excellence for fishing, the best in class in terms of landing facilities, maintenance facilities. I know that I would expect in 68, the conditions of the harbours were fairly basic and they needed investment. So there were 6. They didn't all come about in 1968, but there are 6 now, and they are Killybegs and Donegal, Russellville and Connemara, Dingle and Orundangan in Kerry, Castletownbere, Cork, Dunmore East in Waterford, and Howth in North Dublin. So the 6 of those harbours are essentially owned and operated by this department. So one of our roles is the operational management of those 6 fishery harbour centres. But in addition to that, we have a maintenance and investment role in them. So essentially harbours, by their very nature, they're exposed places of operation, so they need constant investment. So we manage a capital programme of approximately 35 to 40 million each year, which is invested in projects from very small maintenance projects up to quite large dredging projects in each of the 6 fishery harbour centres.
Can you give me an example of the kind of engineering projects then that you're doing at the moment?
There are two that we are active in at the minute, both in the permitting phase, and I might expand on that in a little while. One is the Deepwater Quay in Russellville. Now, that's an existing fishery harbour centre, but there had been an ambition for some time to essentially construct a new deepwater quay, which would facilitate larger vessels, deeper keel vessels, and provide better landing facilities. The piers there are old. It might also help to enhance other activities. There has been interest in the ORE sector off the west coast. So there was every possibility that these facilities would be used for certainly support or operation and maintenance of the ORE installations. So that's one that's live, but it's in a plan. Like, we had started work there. Unfortunately, we applied for a planning extension and got it, but it was appealed and judicially reviewed. So that's in pause, and we're applying for what's known as the substitute consent at the moment to try and restart,
So that's interesting. So even though you're a government department, you still have to go through the same planning process as any commercial operator would do, and you've the same problems as everybody has.
That's something that when I ever talk to my private sector colleagues, they are in awe of, because like in terms of permitting, we have the same hoops, we have the same jumps to go through and all that. So when you ever hear on the news every day of the week about planning and permitting difficulties and compliance, we have the same problems.
Well, listen, let's not talk about that. Neither of us wants pain.
No.
Tell me about when you're looking at a large active harbour and you're thinking about making it so that bigger vessels can come in and that the harbour itself is deeper. How do you even start considering that project? What do you have to think about?
We'll talk maybe about the engineering side of it, because the permitting side is separate, and we've touched on that. At the start of it all, we have to have a sense of what our budget is. What can we expose? All our money is public money, and we have to go through the same hoops in terms of cost-benefit analysis and all that as any other public body. If I take as an example, and I know it's in planning at the moment, but the Russellville project, we'll be looking at the depths that are currently there and the size of vessels that are currently there. And what we chose, bearing in mind the types of vessels that may come in and the benefits that would accrue, that the type of key structure is A. So what we chose there was a 200-metre long quay wall. We chose a berthing pocket, which a berthing pocket is the pocket immediately in front of the quay where vessels tie up and they need a pocket to go up and down within. So we have a berthing pocket there of minus 10 metres. Now, minus 10 metres means that at the lowest possible tide, there's 10 metres of water there all the time. So when ship operators or harbour masters look at that, they'll be looking at vessels that will have to be less than that. So in other words, they'd normally leave a metre clearance. So it's something like vessels that would take 9 metres of water will fit in there. That's your berthing pocket. There's the entrance channel. The entrance channel, you will always have more flexibility on, because the tides go up and down. So where a vessel will have to stay above water all the time, or floating, should I say, in the berthing pocket, in the entrance channel, if there isn't enough water there, you can wait for high tide. So in other words, a vessel can anchor for an hour or two. Then when tide is full, come in and sit into the berthing pocket. The channel coming into Russellville is about minus 0.75, minus 0.8. So it's not as deep as the berthing pocket, and that's why. The other thing you have to consider then is vessels come into these harbours, they'll have to turn. So you have to have a turning circle. So again, in Russellville, we'll say the stern will tie to the pier and the bow will swing around. So you need to have a pocket that's adequately large for them to turn so that they'll be able to exit the harbour. So they're the key attributes for vessels. Now, I suppose in Russellville, the difficulty for us is it's Connemara or marble and granite. It's hard rock, so it's very expensive to remove. So when you think of a cost-benefit analysis, we want to get the best option without spending more money than what we need to spend. So that's where.
How do you get that information? Because technology is changing all the time. And, we're using now kind of all kinds of data and satellite information. And there's drones and all that kind of stuff and things that are able to detect the composition of rocks underwater from like a mile high or whatever. Talk me through that. What is the system and how does it work?
Yeah, we don't use satellites, right?
Okay.
but we use drones a lot. Now, we use drones in a number of areas of our work. They're always useful for recording events during construction, but we might talk about aquaculture in a while. And in terms of inspection, we use drones to do a lot of our inspectorial type work, right? But in terms of the rock, like there's two key things in the harbours that we'd be using. One is bathymetric surveys. So bathymetric surveys are essentially vessels that go out on the water with echo sounders on the back, and they will map the seabed for us, right? Then in understanding what's underneath, we still rely heavily on site investigations. So we will map out what we'll want to do, and then we'll tender for a site investigation contractor who essentially will bring a rig on site and drill, maybe we'll say sample 20 holes for the area that we want to construct in it. We will look at those samples, record what's coming out. So in terms of the depth of silt that's above, the depth of rock that's below, the hardness of the rock, all that sort of thing. That then in turn feeds into our tender process, because we will have to tender all these projects to contractors. The contractors will need to understand how much silt do I need to remove, how much rock do I need to remove, how hard is it, and all that. So the better the information that we have at front end, the better chance we have of not getting into dispute with the contractor. And I'm sure everybody hears every day of the week of disputes with contractors. That, I'll be honest about it, its scope and the quality of information that you can provide at tender stage can eliminate that,
Information and communication is just so important. You don't think about that generally when it comes to engineering. What you're doing is fascinating. I love it because it's really big projects. And it's in very challenging conditions. No, always in any organization, you need new blood and fresh blood coming in. And, people are trying to encourage, secondary school students and university people and stuff like that. When you're talking to people starting their career and you kind of say, you should come to the department because you'd enjoy, how do you just sell the work and the challenges and the kind of stuff that would interest them?
First of all, there's the lack of knowledge of what we do, but there's also a perception probably on the engineering construction side that it's dirty work and it's messy and that sort of thing. Really, I suppose if I was to encourage anybody, it's very interesting work. It's very challenging. It's in the interface between land and marine. Civil engineering work on land, everybody will see this, but this is in an interface between the marine space and the land space. You need to have a knowledge of water. You need to have a knowledge of tides. You need to have a knowledge of the land-based infrastructure that ties into that. In terms of encouraging them, I suppose the best thing I would do is bring colleagues along to talk to them and tell them how much they enjoy what they do. What we're trying as well is to engage with third level institutions and do work placements and apprenticeships and anything. We hope to have actually our first couple starting shortly in Host, which it's a new experience for us. It's something that's been there for a while, but again, maybe in the past we didn't have as much difficulty getting staff. We do now, so we have to do a bit more work in encouraging them in,
And you mentioned colleagues telling stories. What kind of stories do they tell then?
It's always almost project related and challenge and what we did. I like an example that always comes to mind, and I don't have the details off the top of my head, but we have one of our areas of responsibility is Cape Clear. And you'd say, boy, we won't go into that, but it's an area of responsibility the department has, right? So North Harbour in Cape Clear suffered from a nasty wave when there were winds from the north, making it poor shelter for vessels when they were in the harbour, particularly. Not as much fishing there, but there's regular ferry vessels in and out. So it's important that they're sheltered.
Yeah.
So we looked at a project there in 2016 and they came up with essentially floodgates, hydraulically operated floodgates to protect the harbour during storm events. But the challenging thing in Cape Clear is it's an island. It's a number of miles off the coast. Nothing is easily done there. So you can't get concrete from your local concrete plant. You can't. Everything has to come there by boat and get assembled there. So what was done, and this is the interesting part, like the contractor that did the work essentially prefabricated the structure in a dry dock in Cork. So essentially a concrete base, 20 metres by 20 metres, two walls, 20 metres by 20 again, and then sealed the ends. So what you had was a big lump of concrete weighing about 250, 300 tonne. And then the dry dock was floated or flooded. And the box, I call it essentially, was towed from Vrome Dockyard in Cork to Cape Clear, put into place, flooded and sunk in. So instead of building a large concrete base and large concrete walls in sight on water, which is very difficult always, this was done in the dry in Cork, but the ingenious part was floating it. Now, everybody says to me, how can you float a big box of concrete? But you can, if you work it correctly, like if the buoyancy is done correctly and that. So like of that box, it was probably 20 metres deep. Where it sat in the water, it was probably 10 metres out of the water, maybe 10 metres into the water. It was floating. It was floating and it had to be certified, and the Marine Survey Office had to be happy that this won't sink and block a navigation channel or whatever it is. So that's interesting. And like the buzz about things like that, when it comes to site and you're getting it into place and dropping it in, there's a bit of a high and that sort of thing, you know.
I'm not surprised. That is a very big and bold project. I mean, you must have more things that are kind of in the back of your mind coming up in the future, because I mean, the weather is changing and the sea is changing and conditions are changing, and that must be changing things for harbours and facilities across the country. Do you think kind of as we go ahead in time that you will have more big, bold projects like that?
I do think so. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about climate change and sea level rise and all that. And we have to design around that. And I suppose one of the key things is adaptation. And essentially that's changing what you have to deal with what you know is going to happen. So for example, that Dinish project in Castletownbere, we looked at the sea level rise, we looked at the pier levels, and we ensured that they're at an adequate level to accommodate that. But in addition to that, we built the breakwaters, which are on the outside. So essentially the function of the breakwaters there is to provide adequate shelter or more shelter to the harbour than what was previously there. You know, you're completely right. There's two things, I suppose. One is the climate adaptation piece, that we have to adapt what we have to ensure that is adequate going forward. But I suppose the other thing we shouldn't forget about, and it's not directly our remit, but we're keenly aware of it in the background, is the energy transition to ORE. While ORE will be probably more on the East Coast at the moment and probably the South East Coast.
What is ORE?
It's offshore renewable energy. So essentially wind turbines. We've had a lot of wind turbine installation on land. And of course, we've had the farm off Wicklow there for many years. But this is a growing sector, and government ambition is serious for the next 5 to 10 years in that space. So all of those ORE installations will require support vessels. Some will need construction support. I'm not of the view that our harbours are adequate in terms of construction support, because the vessels that will do that are very, very large, possibly Killybegs, which is the biggest one. But certainly in terms of the support space and operation and maintenance and all that, I think we will have a very large part to play in that. So
you're an Engineers Ireland fellow.
Yes.
So when you're dealing with kind of younger engineers who are coming up, is there any kind of commonality there that you notice, like a gap that younger engineers are missing?
We talked about this earlier, that I came from the private sector to the public sector. I probably had a view when I was in the private sector that the public sector had an easier time, shall I say, than it was probably more challenging, and you have to perform in the private sector. But then I joined the department here, and there were 25, 30 existing engineers who became my colleagues. And I have to say, I was very impressed with all of their competence. Now, their drivers were different to mine. I had come from a private sector where you worked for a company and you did your best for the company, and the company was your main stakeholder. In the public sector, it's much wider than that. You're working for a government department, but there are politicians, there are local elected representatives, and there's the public, and the public has a certain ownership of civil servants, I think. So, and you are dealing with public money, so you have to answer for that also. I have to say, when I came here, I was impressed with everything. Now, I liked to come here with a person knowing nothing about where or how things operated here. It was good to come with a very clean slate and come with my views. And I think that's a good thing. And maybe a bit of cross-pollination is a good thing. In terms of younger engineers, I think they're fantastic nowadays. I reflect back when I did engineering, we didn't do work placements, and a lot of us probably went abroad for the summer and either had a good time or worked in hotels or whatever it was. But most students going through now have work placements. So by the time that they have their degree, they have a better knowledge of work than I think we did in our day, you know. Now, I must say, to be fair to them as well, work is far more challenging now than what it was in our day. And I think of things like procurement, health and safety, all the disciplines in and around construction, they were lighter weight in 1983 and 84 than what they are now. So engineers nowadays have to grapple with a lot more.
And a final question for you, Noel, and might be a difficult one for you, all right? Because you've been in both camps. You've worked private sector for a long time. You've worked public sector for a long time. Mm-hmm. Which do you prefer?
It's very funny you asked me that now, because I met a colleague this morning and they said to me, he's going to ask you this question.
No way. All right. Okay.
Yeah. To compare the public and the private, because the public is my current employer. I have to be very careful with what I say. I'll compare and contrast and sit on the fence, maybe, you know.
There you go.
One of the things that I miss from the private sector, and you spoke about one of my larger projects, and I did a number of those, right? And there was a sense of clear direction when you were on a large project. There was an end game target that you were heading towards. And some of the teams I would have worked on now, when I say teams, at large sites with large numbers of staff, there up to 400 or whatever, but everybody was driving towards that goal. And there were, of course, disputes and falling outs and all that. But generally speaking, there was a huge amount of buy-in and trying to achieve that goal. And when it was, there was a massive sense of achievement, right? So I loved that. I missed that. I think in the public sector, I'm a client now as opposed to being a contractor. So I employ contractors. I still love to get projects done, but it's far more difficult to get that buzz, you know. And maybe that's not just private, public. Maybe it's just projects have become more difficult. Procurement is much more involved. Maybe there are more disputes involved. Compliance with regulatory authorities is more involved, all that. So it's probably more difficult to get that buzz, you know. But I think all that said, I'm 13 years now in the public sector, and I've really enjoyed my 13 years there as well.
Do you know, we're very similar in that I've spent a lot of time in the private sector. I've spent a lot of time in the public sector, in broadcasting, obviously. And I wouldn't have a preference like you. I can't say that I preferred either one. Both of them were really interesting. Both of them were very challenging. And what I found that I really enjoyed with our chat today, Noel, is that I think a lot of people don't consider the public sector, especially on an engineering side of things, like, you know, but the things that you have said today and the stories that you've shared and the mammoth projects that you're working on, I mean, it's very much a case of it's engineer versus Mother Nature. And you don't get any bigger a challenge than that. Do you know what I mean? So listen, let me thank you very much for joining us today and sharing all your stories. If you'd like to learn more about Noel and his work in fishery, harbours and marine infrastructure, check out the links for DAFM Marine Engineering Division and Engineers Ireland in the show notes. But for now, Noel, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Dusty. Bye-bye for now.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation today. If you do know another engineer who would appreciate these insights, please do share our podcast with them. They can find us simply by searching for Engineers Ireland wherever they listen to podcasts. This episode is produced by dustpod.io for Engineers Ireland. For advanced episodes, more information on the latest trends in infrastructure or career development advice, you can find a wealth of resources online at engineersireland.ie. Until next time, from myself, Dusty Rhodes, thank you for listening.